With the act of domestic terrorism in Pittsburgh and its grieving Jewish community struggling to come to terms with the horrific massacre of 11 people, grandparents, siblings, and friends at the Tree of Life synagogue. 46-year-old white supremacist terrorist Roger Bowers posted anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant posts on social media before he went on his lethal rampage. And while criminals are indeed responsible for their crimes, they don't happen in a vacuum. And it is that political climate currently in the United States that I will be discussing with my guests, former Israeli ambassador to France, Avi Pazner, former ambassador and member of the Israeli parliament, Colette Avital, former ambassador and CEO of the America-Israel Initiative Second Thought, Yoram Ettinger, and Haaretz columnist Bradley Burston. It is good to see all of you. Thank you for coming on the show today. This massacre has raised the issue of anti-Semitism, but also rhetoric in the Trump era and the political climate ahead of the midterm elections. We just saw the pipe bomb scare. We saw a white man kill two blacks in a supermarket in Kentucky a few days ago. Where do you see, Avi, this massacre of 11 Jews during prayers fit in?
First of all, I see it as a first in the history of the United States. We never had a massacre. Jews were massacred in Europe, in Arab countries. Elsewhere, but in the United States, there was always a limit, a very strict limit. And it is maybe because of the actual controversies inflaming the American society that this act could have taken place.
Bradley, really quickly before we go for our break, Trump's initial response was typical about gun debate, about arming more people. Is he right?
Well, first of all, I think he's not, but I think that what we're going to see from Trump and his people is a way to try to make political capital from this, probably not so much in terms of guns, but maybe in terms of the death penalty.
Yeah, that's what he was calling for, right? To put that person to death when he's caught. Of course he's caught. All right, I want to go start with you, get your reaction basically to this whole horrific story.
Well, first of all, I think that it's heartbreaking. We never thought it would happen in America. It's a question of the general climate, but also a combination between the general climate and anti-Semitism. And the question is, where will it end? So I thought that instead of sending only condolences and saying how much pain we feel, I'd like to read a poem by Yehuda Amichai.
Please, one of Israel's most famous poets.
And the poem is called Poem Without an End. Inside the brand new museum, there is an old synagogue. Inside the synagogue is me. Inside me, my heart. Inside my heart, museum. Inside the museum, a synagogue. Inside it, me. Inside me, my heart. Inside my heart, a museum. And inside our hearts, the people, the victims, certainly their families.
It's almost as if that was written for what we saw, what happened, isn't it? Yeah. It's amazing. Yoram, I want to show you something that Education Minister Naftali Bennett said when he traveled to Pittsburgh to mourn there with people from that congregation. And here is what he told our chief Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv.
This is a devastating attack, but life will prevail, and good will prevail over evil. And I think the big message is one of unity.
Does Israel have any role? Because in some countries on earth, sometimes Israelis have gone overseas, sent by the government to at least advise. Maybe America doesn't need that.
No, America certainly has its act together and knows how to protect its own people, but we are at its service for anything they may need.
So Naftali Bennett saying there that America has its act together. Does America have its act together?
It seems to me that this horrific act of terrorism, in fact, unfortunately, has been with the U.S. for the last 400 years since the arrival of the early pilgrims, namely anti-Semitism. Not in such a degree, but anti-Semitism has been an inherent part of the U.S. reality. However, it has been an aberration. It has been an abhorrent type of aberration. And when you look at the U.S. today relatively to Europe and any other part of the world, yes, it has its act together, plenty of room to improve, but way, way above the rest of the free world. And when it comes to Judaism and anti-Semitism, there's no doubt that when you observe the most authentic reflection of the American society, which is the House of Representatives. Every 700,000 people elect their own people, and they better adhere to their constituents, or else they would be sent out of Congress. On Capitol Hill, in the House of Representatives, the esteem, the respect towards Judeo-Christian values, towards the Jewish state, towards Judaism is very, very high. Right. And it seems to me the test of society is not whether such abhorrent reality happens once in a while, but how does the society deal with that? And in my mind, it's going to constrain it, it's going to prosecute it, it's going to punish it severely in accordance with the U.S. own track record.
Avi, as happens when Israel gets involved, sometimes in these stories, things tend to get political. There are already divisions, shall I say, between Jews who support Trump and Jews who don't support Trump. I want to show you a tweet of David Simon, who is a very famous author and television screenwriter, who was not happy that Naftali Bennett, the education minister we saw earlier, was coming to the U.S. He says, "Go home." Netanyahu's interventions in U.S. politics aided in the election of Donald Trump and his raw and relentless validation of white nationalism and fascism. The American Jewish community is now bleeding at the hands of the Israeli prime minister, and many of us know it. Very, very harsh words.
I am appalled by this kind of reaction when an Israeli minister comes to share the grief with the American Jewish community. There is no place for politics. We are all Jews. We may have been victims of anti-Semitism. I was victim in my youth of anti-Semitism. I think this is, you spoke about abhorrent. This is abhorrent.
That's abhorrent?
And absolutely, absolutely, there's no place for such a kind
Bradley,
of reaction.
there are other voices. For example, Jane Iser, the editor-in-chief of The Forward, who wrote an op-ed right after this massacre, said something along these lines, albeit a bit more calmly, saying that the U.S. Jews who aligned themselves with Donald Trump should rethink this alliance because of the rhetoric. Almost, in a way, I think, blaming Donald Trump for this massacre. Does she have a point?
Well, I think that you have to look at it in the resolution of the idea that supporting Trump as opposed to supporting Republican ideals have become two very different things. Trump as an individual, in the way that he says things, and in the way that he inflames his base, and in the way he coddles the white nationalists, as opposed to the Republican politicians at large. That's the problem. The question is, if you support Trump specifically, and if you do, you have to really start to rethink it, unless he's willing to specifically renounce his white nationalist supporters.
Right, which he hasn't yet.
Which he has not yet.
I want to show you something else, Colette, that Ron Lauder, the president of the World Jewish Congress, told our correspondent, Dan Raviv, yesterday in Pittsburgh. Let's take a look.
I expected this in every other country but the United States. We've never had something like this. We've heard that there was sizzling below the surface, but frankly, we are shocked and dismayed. This is a great country, we're great people, and this is not who we are.
In the United States, we didn't have to post armed guards.
In the United States, we should never have done it, never have armed guards, but more and more I'm convinced that it might be necessary.
He's saying that maybe the U.S. should start securing synagogues, which sometimes happens, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in European countries. Is that what should happen in the United States? Can you imagine that? That is a big step for the Jewish community in the United States.
Look, when there were acts of terrorism, all our consulates were being protected by the United States. American embassies are protected abroad, so I don't think that this is a very big issue. I think, however, that one has to remember, and I just would like to react, that there are all kinds of anti-Semitism. There's not only the religious kind of anti-Semitism from the pilgrims on, there is also the kind of anti-Semitism that is connected with what Israel is doing lately, and there's this kind of anti-Semitism that is related to the wealth that the Jews have, and so on. So I don't think that the United States has its act together. I think that what you have seen and what you see all the time with the violence rampant, with people coming and shooting in schools, all of this should be rethought. And I think that the idea of arms control is something that has to be taken very seriously now. Certainly, if you combine the possibility to acquire arms and shoot for anything that one objects to, and doesn't like the Jew next door because he's too wealthy or because he's too successful and he comes up with a gun. That combination between arms on the one hand and anti-Semitism on the other hand is lethal, and unfortunately we should have known that at one day it would happen. So the question is if there is any way of stopping that, of fighting against that. I don't know.
I want to show you something that was making a lot of noise here in Israel, and it is the way how ultra-Orthodox media was covering this massacre in Pittsburgh. We want to show you some of these papers with the translations. Basically, all of these headlines were saying that they were not murdered in a synagogue. They wouldn't say the word synagogue. They would use the word Jewish center. For example, this is Massacre, 11 Jews murdered in a shooting attack, and more and more. And even the chief rabbi, Israel Lau, doesn't seem to think that these people are Jews because most of them.
Terrible.
Go ahead.
Terrible. And that's where it has to stop. I think it's perfectly fine for the newspapers to report on anything they want, whatever way they want. They report about women in odd ways and about gay people in odd ways. Whatever they like is fine because their readers expect it. But when the chief rabbi of Israel, who is supposed to represent not only all of the Jews of Israel, but also is a figure representing all Jews everywhere, disallows the idea that the people who are going to a conservative shul are actually going to a synagogue, then there's something terribly wrong. Then he's not being a rabbi.
Right. What's your reaction to this?
I would say that the very fact that it is Bennett who is a modern Orthodox Jew, a politician,
He's a
but
politician.
he went
he
there.
Has understood.
But he went there. He went to the synagogue. Okay, he did not mention the fact that it was not exactly his stream. That's the right approach to do. I mean, once Jews start to disregard other Jews because they go in such a community or such a synagogue, this is very bad for the one thing which is important to us, I believe, and this is the unity of the Jewish people.
The question, Avi, however, is, okay, I think he did the right thing twice. First by going there, and then his statements were all embracing. What will he do when he comes back? What will the government do when he comes back? Are the other streams going to be recognized and dealt with?
I hope so. I certainly hope.